Well, the Emmanuel Macron honeymoon, of which I was never a participant in, sure didn't last long, huh? The new president of France got some much-deserved criticism the other day when he claimed Africa had, quote, civilizational problems, adding that the challenge facing Africa, which isn't a country, it's a continent, is that women are having 8 and 9 children. If you read between the lines, you see that this is essentially a dog whistle to France and the rest of the world that, yeah, we have to figure out how to decrease the black population. That's really what this is about. But let's add context to the comment first before going into more detail. A journalist from the Ivory Coast asked Macron what his views were on a Marshall Plan for Africa. For those that don't know, the Marshall Plan was an agenda set forth by the United States after World War II to aid Western Europe's recovery and to help rebuild what was destroyed during the fighting. The U.S. pledged what would today be $130 billion in economic support for European countries. Countries like the United Kingdom would likely look very different today had it not been for the Marshall Plan. This sped up growth in the agricultural and industrial sectors so well that in many cases production surpassed pre-war levels. So white folks were more than willing to break bread with other white folks to make sure Europe didn't fall off after World War II. So obviously the African continent would get the same thing too, right? No. There has been no Marshall Plan for Africa post-colonialism, just as there has been no Marshall Plan for Black America post-slavery. You see, I'd imagine that establishment white Europeans like Macron, just like whites within the establishment in America, want to keep black folks exactly where we are, whether we be in America or in Africa. That's why we've never had our own Marshall Plan, which would serve as essential reparations. France has a long history of disassociating their role in coups d'etats and colonial imperialism in Africa, so Macron's words cannot be separated from what has been said before by previous presidents, such as Nicolas Sarkozy, who enraged many Africans in 2007 after winning the French election and giving his first speech in Africa in the country of Senegal, at the Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, no less. He made a series of highly apologetic statements about colonialism, stating that colonialism couldn't be blamed for Africa's current problems. He also stated that Africans had not yet entered into history, whatever the hell that means, thereby portraying all Africans as tribal. Africa doesn't have civilizational problems. You have to look at each country differently because all African countries are not the same. This is why I was never on the Macron bandwagon. Yeah, I didn't want Marine Le Pen, a far-right extremist, to win. However, I was not blinded by a centrist, pro-status quo candidate like Macron either. France had a lesser of two evils election, much like America. It's just the French were smart enough not to vote in their version of Donald Trump. Macron has made statements in the past that might have suggested that he'd take a much more progressive approach when it comes to France's relations with Francophone nations on the African continent. Now, though, words mean nothing without policy, so any previous commitment to change seems irrelevant now. Nicolas Sarkozy also made promises to make changes and didn't follow through. So to make it seem as though Africans couldn't get a Marshall Plan because their population is too large is absolutely ridiculous. According to The Guardian, African women average more than 4 births each. It is higher in countries like Chad and Nigeria, but for a number of reasons, such as a high infant mortality rate and a high demand for child labor. You see, more than 1 in 5 children in Africa between the ages of 5 and 17 work on farms, in stone quarries, and in mines, against their will. No, let's talk about what Macron's real issue is. This is about France maintaining a neo-colonial grip on the continent through military and money. It exerts its presence specifically in nations that it used to dominate. To this day, France plays a critical, if not monumental, role in about 20 countries on the continent of Africa. It has, quote, defense agreements with nearly half the countries in Africa, which gives them a major military presence on the continent. Much of this occurred during the Cold War to, quote-unquote, protect African countries from communism, among other things. The overwhelming French military activity has become problematic for many Africans who want to be able to handle their own affairs, I'd imagine. So in 2004, the African Union created the Peace and Security Council with its own African standby force. The idea is to weaken the argument for some supposed need for French soldiers in nearly 24 African countries. Now, we should know by now that if Europeans are committing as much as they are to foreign policy to a particular place as the French are on the African continent, then they're likely there stealing resources. You see, that's the economic angle to this. French companies import goods from countries across West and Central Africa. Uranium from Niger and Gabon, cocoa from the Ivory Coast, and more. 75% of the electricity in Africa comes from nuclear power. So basically the entire source of France's energy is dependent on resources found in Africa. To this day, France maintains economic domination in many African nations through currency as well. The French treasury maintains control of the CFA franc, which is the currency used in 14 African nations, including Mali, Benin, Cameroon, the Ivory Coast, Congo, Chad, and others. Some of these countries, such as Mali and the Ivory Coast, are required to deposit a whopping 2/3 of their foreign exchange surpluses into French banking accounts, money that is literally helping to prop up French financial institutions. Make no mistake, France is looting the continent of Africa, but they're far from the only ones. It should be well known by now that many African nations are prevented from becoming the economic powerhouses they could truly become because it's more profitable for white people and increasingly the Chinese to plunder the continent without having strong African governments that would charge higher fees. And of course, be competition. There are some success stories around the continent where there is still a major problem of neocolonialism from sea to sea. Let's also not forget the role that the French played in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. It was the French government that supported the Hutu regime that massacred 800,000 Tutsis and some Hutus as well, while the French military forces, the ones they claim are there to prevent genocides like this from occurring, they sat back and watched it happen. You see, those military forces are there more so to make sure no leftist governments or overly progressive leaders take power in one of these nations that France is heavily dependent on. France has a lot of blood on its hands and has left colonial battle scars across the continent. It remains to be seen how the rest of Macron's presidency will play out. Maybe he does make progressive changes, but my money is on business as usual, which is what one would expect from a centrist neoliberal. Also, we in America on the left need not look to the Macrons of the world as an example on how to move forward. If there is anything that has been made clear over the past few years, it's the disdain and disgust for all things status quo and all things establishment. People feel this way regardless of whether you're talking about Democrats, Republicans, or independents. We need to push America further to the left, and the so-called center today is not the same center of 20 to 30 years ago, because the country itself has shifted further and further to the right, which is why I think radical progressivism is the way to go to get the country we truly want and deserve. But that's another video for another day. If you like this video, share and leave a comment. Follow me on Twitter and check out my blog at www.blackandintellectual.com.